Well, we continue with our series on the Bible and the story-shaped world. This is a little difficult at this time because our attendance is very up and down and inconsistent. I am putting all of these messages up online on YouTube, and they're linked to the site I've mentioned before that's in the Bulletin, Bible in America. So you can pick up on anything you missed, but some of you who are here more consistently may feel like some of this is repetitious because I find myself needing to sort of be sure everybody's up to speed and on the same channel as we try to go through this material. I'll remind you that we started with the end, with Revelation 21, and then we jumped back, as we will again this morning, to Genesis 1. So we started both ends to meet in the middle. And what I want you to see about the biblical narrative is that, again, despite the fact it's all these different documents written over a period of roughly 1,500 years, it's one continuous narrative and one continuous story. I am well aware that when I began as a young Christian in my teenage years, I was not aware of any. I should start to say I was not aware of all of this. I wasn't aware of any of this. My understanding about what I was entering into when I confessed faith in Jesus Christ, what kind of story I was becoming part of, what movement in human history I was becoming part of, I was clueless. I did not see any of that. And I suspect that would be true of many of you, depending on your experience and upbringing and all the rest. But we come to faith in Jesus for lots of different reasons, under lots of different influences and so on. And most of the time when we start, it's pretty basic stuff we're hearing. We are not usually getting this big picture of what has happened in the world through the gospel, through the biblical story, and not only where we came from, but where we're going. Now, I want to call your attention, before we go back to Genesis, in particular to one line in Revelation 21. We read it before, but I want to remind you of it. 3 times in the book of Revelation, we get God saying, either in the person of Jesus or God the Father, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, which are, of course, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. So the beginning and the end. And to be sure you get that, in Revelation 21, verse 6, Jesus is speaking and he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Now that, in a way, summarizes what I'm trying to do in this series of messages, is to understand that always in the Scripture, there's this constant reference back and forth to the beginning and the end. Everything in the middle, and by the middle, I'm talking about everything else besides Genesis 1 and the last chapters of Revelation. Everything else is the middle, so to speak. And in that middle, all through it, Old Testament and New, there's constant turning back and forth between looking back to the beginning and forward to the end. We never get away from that. Think of our own practice of the Lord's Supper, which, by the way, we're going to have to make a decision about in session pretty soon as to when and how we'll have the Lord's Supper again. But think of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus said, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. And yet, so it's looking back, right? But at the same time, it's looking forward. Because also, it says, whenever you do this, you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. So even in that most sacred of sacraments that Christians are urged to practice, as he puts it, as often as you do it. No particular time schedule is set out in the Scriptures. As often as you do it, it's looking back, it's looking forward. That's always the way it is. So as we go back to Genesis 1, to the creation story, it's already hinting at the future. And the future will always be looking back at two things from that story in particular. The creation itself, that there's one God who's creator of heaven and earth. We just said it in our creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. But then it also is looking back to the failure of the image bearers of God, the humans. Sin entering the world. And we never get away from that. Until the end, when Jesus says in Revelation 21, it's finished. It's all done. And I'm making all things new, he says. All right. So, all the way through, looking back at the beginning, forward to the end. We see this emphasis on God as the first and the last, and this way of thinking that I've just remarked on, in Isaiah chapter 48. Isaiah 48, verse 12. Listen to me, O Jacob and Israel, whom I called. I am he, I am the first and the last. So you get God saying the same thing in the Old Testament that's said in the New. My hand laid the foundation of the earth, and my right hand spread out the heavens. When I call to them, they stand forth together. Now that's a perspective that you can see in many places in the prophets, and I want to stress it. Here we are in the prophet Isaiah, no telling how long after the creations happened, and still the prophet is looking back to God saying, I laid the foundations of the heavens and the earth. They stand together, though, and this is the part we need to begin to get. We live in a world where we're raised in a worldview that separates heaven from earth, even for believers, even for Christians. There's this tendency to think of heaven and earth as separate. But the biblical narrative never does that. It always treats heaven and earth as one. Now, earth is obviously clear. I mean, that's this physical world in which we live. But heaven in the Bible is used in multiple ways. It can be used to refer to what we think of as atmosphere, space. But more often, it's used simply as a reference to everything that transcends earth as the dwelling place of God. And that needs to be clear to us, that there's never this... the way it's often worded in our time is as natural and supernatural. And so in our scientific technological world, we think of the natural things, natural law, things governed by natural law. And the more we discover about natural law, the more God is pushed aside. As time goes by and we learn more about the way the physical world works, the more there's a tendency in our thinking for God to become less and less relevant until you get naturalistic atheism, which erases God altogether. But as I think I put in your bulletin a quote about that, yes, I did, from Robin Schumacher, you can count on it like the rising of the sun. When you hold God's funeral, someone will always take his place. The names differ, but the pattern remains the same. Yes, you cannot erase the divine from human experience without something or someone stepping into that void. We see it in totalitarian countries all through the history of the world. We're seeing it now in the renewed rise of some totalitarian regimes that simply forbid putting faith in God over faith in the government. And it's a strong pattern, it's a strong tendency. The humans will do that over and over and over. Okay, so back to Genesis 1. So throughout the biblical story, you have this constant reference back to creation, But as I said last time, we tend to read this creation story through the eyes of science and technology today and fail to see that that's not the eyes through which the first readers were reading it, nor the eyes that any ancient Near Eastern person would have had as they read it. They would see the story very differently. There was never any question that the story is saying God created everything. First verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's probably a reference to the material creation. Whenever it happened, God did it. But the rest of these 7 days narrated in chapter 1 of Genesis are not about material creation. They're about organization and structure. You can see it in the way things are worded. You start at the beginning with the text saying, tohu wabohu, this poetic sounding expression in Hebrew that everything was empty and void. A chaotic picture. And you have this reference to the Spirit of God moving over the deep waters. Again, for the ancient Near Eastern people, a symbol of chaos and disorder. And then you see God stepping in and begins to order things. And the structure is very clear. The first few days, God structures environments. And then in the next few days, He fills those environments. I'll let you read that for yourself. But He creates an air environment. Later, He fills it with birds. He creates a land environment and fills it with animals. But all of that is about structure, not about the first material creation. Because where this is all moving is toward the seventh day. Now you get all these days, and let's get down to chapter 1, verse 31. God saw all that He had made, and it was very good, evening and morning, the sixth day. So for these 6 days, we've seen everything being put in order. Again, it's hard for us to think this way, but for the ancients, we have lots of ancient Near Eastern literature in the Bible and outside the Bible, and there's no evidence in any of it that they were concerned about the physical nature of things. They were concerned about the purpose and order of things. So something wasn't real until it was put in proper order. And that's what's going on here. Because as you move from the chaos at the beginning to the end of the sixth day, what then happens? Chapter 2, verse 1. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed, or we could say were ordered, were put in order. By the seventh day, God completed His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it He rested from His work of creation. I mentioned last time that it puzzled me for a long time. What is going on here? I could not conceive that God needed to take a break. That He needed to sit down in His easy chair the seventh day and sit back and just relax. That's not what's going on. But because we don't understand the way people thought then, and what any ancient Near Eastern person, whether they were Jewish or any of the other surrounding people, all would have seen what was going on here in a way that we don't see it. Again, there's lots of textual evidence of this. What they understood is, first of all, for a God, just any God in the ancient Near Eastern thinking, to enter into the temple and rest meant that everything, all the main work was done, all the organization was done. Now it's time to govern. And the God governs from the temple. The God governs from their place of rest. And you'll see this expression rest used throughout the Old Testament as we see Israel develop into a kingship and they develop their temple and so on. We'll see references like David rested after all these battles. David rested because he defeated all his enemies. But it doesn't mean he quit governing or wasn't doing anything. It means he wasn't going off to battle anymore. He'd settled things. Things were now in order. And you'll see the same thing about Solomon. For God to rest means God has completed the order of things. Now it's time to govern. And this governance of God, which we later will call providence, never ceases. And you'll get two very telling statements from Jesus about the Sabbath that inform all of this. In one, Jesus says repeatedly in the Gospels, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, that's one to keep in mind. And the other is, it's in John 5:17, Jesus speaking to his critics, and they're in another one of these Sabbath controversies, and he says, my Father is working to this day, and so am I. John 5:17. It's what we already thought. God doesn't need to take a break. He's working. His providential government of things is always ongoing. There's never this separation between heaven and earth, the natural and the supernatural. It's all one in the providence of God. Okay, so we've seen that Genesis 1 is not a scientific statement. And by the way, there's no place in the Old Testament where God updates the science for the Jews. We know when we're reading it with 20/20 hindsight that there's all sorts of conceptions in the text and the poetry that sound very unscientific to us. And we try to impose on those texts some kind of a compromise or some kind of a method to say, well, God is, I don't know, whatever we try to do to make it fit modern science. But that wasn't the concern. Nowhere does God tell the Jews, by the way, your conception that the earth is sitting still and the sun is going around us, that's wrong. Let me just update you on that. God never does that. He always meets us where we are. And that's as true today as it was then. Our science today may prove in many ways to be wrong. Give us another 100 years and see what happens. God always meets us where we are. And that's the way he met them. That's the way he expects us to read it and to understand it. Now there is another interesting phenomena going on in this Genesis 1 story, is that all the surrounding nations had their own creation stories, their own methods by which they saw the gods and goddesses putting things in order. And I used to give an assignment in my Old Testament classes and have students compare one or two other creation stories, like from Babylon, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and so on, with the biblical story. And all those other stories that have all faded away so that only people who study this kind of thing even know them, the other stories seem absurd to us. You have this god and this goddess who get in a war. Tiamat, the goddess of the great oceans and the waters, fights Marduk, and they have this great battle. And out of the battle, they end up creating people and animals, or often it's the gods having sex, and that's how it happens. I mean, there's all these stories of gods and goddesses doing all kinds of things that humans do, only in some supernatural, powerful way, some of which has been embodied in recent Hollywood movies. But the Bible rejects all of that, but it does it most of the time simply by stating the simple truth. Genesis 1 makes this simple statement: in the beginning, God. Just God. There is no God but God. And God does this and that, puts things in order, and creates humans to be his image bearers. Creates humans 6th day in his image. Well, what has God done then? God has created a great temple. The whole cosmos is God's temple. You can see that in a number of texts, but I'll share particularly Isaiah 66, 1 and 2. God speaking says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool." You see that in that poetic language, God is saying, this whole thing is my temple. It's all mine. When I rest in my temple, I'm resting in what I created. And every temple to a god has within it the image of the god. But the Jews are told not to make any images of the god. It's 10 Commandments. Don't make any graven images. Why not? Well, because the image of the god is us. The image of the god and the temple of God are the humans. They are the image. Only these images aren't wood and stone like the pagan idols. These images have free will, and they actually are able to rebel against the very God who put them in his temple. So in this way of thinking, which would have been a very normal way of thinking for ancient Near Eastern people and the Jews, that when God created and organized all of this, the whole thing is his temple. And the Sabbath that all this works for, all 6 days are leaning toward that Sabbath. The Sabbath is the time to say, okay, images of mine, enter into my rest. Enter into my government. I've given it all to you to govern. Now enter into it as my image bearers, as my representatives in my temple. Govern it as I command you to do. Now we'll see, not time to do this morning, but we'll see as we move on to what I've called the middle, that when it gets to the point when the Jews are a called out people to represent God in a special new way to the rest of the world, we will see that they are commanded to build a tabernacle at first, which is a portable temple, right? And then later a fixed physical temple in Jerusalem. And we will see that all that temple stuff reflects back to this first chapter. The temple will have carvings and symbols of plants and animals in it. It will have a special holy place, Holy of Holies, where God's throne is. Really, the Ark of the Covenant will be called his footstool, as he is seated above the Ark symbolically, and the Ark is his footstool, which harks back to Eden. Now, as you read, we'll go on with this, but as you read about Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, which is a high place, we know it's a high place because water flows from it down onto the earth. It's a high place, and when they're cast out and they're barred from going back in, they're still in Eden. And you'll see the references to moving further and further from Eden, because where they were originally in the garden was the Holy of Holies. It was the most holy place with God. And they're forbidden to go back there. And when we see the temples being built, there'll be a Holy of Holies, the most holy place, which can only be entered under very specific, carefully governed circumstances on the Day of Atonement by the high priest. All of this hangs together. All the symbolism hangs together. We begin to see this forecast in the fourth day. Beginning at verse 14 of Genesis 1. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for festivals and for days and years." Okay, now if you're following me in your own Bible, there's a good chance in verse 14 you didn't see the word festivals. You saw the word seasons. None of you are following, so you didn't notice that. It's very common to translate that word seasons like it's about, fall and winter and spring and so on. That's not what it's about. This translation has got it right. This word translated festivals occurs about 160 times in the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. And in virtually every other case, it refers to some holy religious festival or to the temple itself. So this 4th day, when it talks about the lights, you'll notice it never says sun and moon. It's no doubt referring to sun and moon, but it doesn't say it, and probably the reason is this is an implicit or tacit, silent rebuke of all those pagans around them that are worshiping the sun and the moon. Of all the heavenly bodies, nothing has been worshipped more often in the history of the world and in the ancient Near East than the sun and the moon. So the story is very careful just to call them lights, not sun, and that they're signs for the religious festivals that are to come. They will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, and it was so. God made the 2 great lights. The greater light had dominion over the day, the lesser light had dominion over the night. And then it's almost like an afterthought. And also the stars. Again, the stars, the constellations. Many of you know I'm engaged for fun in astrophotography. And as I look at astrophotography books and I try to find my way around the heavens, we're still using, in our modern astronomy, all those constellation signs from the ancient world. They're still normal. Even though modern astronomy and cosmology, doesn't worship these constellations, we still identify them. And those constellation identifications go all the way back to the ancient Near East and up through the Greek and Roman period. We're about to see Orion come back in the sky at night. And all these images. All right, so again, this narrative is saying by tacit or silent rebuke, and by the way, God created the stars. They're not gods. God created them. They're lights. They're symbols. They're signs that God put in the heavens. And you will see as we've already looked at some of the book of Revelation, that these heavenly signs will show up again in a special way at the end. And God saw that it was good, we're told. Evening and morning, the 4th day. So we get this, everything as I've said, leaning in toward the Sabbath, leaning in toward the 7th day. And as I started to say before, it used to puzzle me why the Sabbath is given so much attention. It ends up in the 10 Commandments, right next to things like not to murder and steal and commit adultery and worship idols and stuff like that. It becomes very central in the history of Israel, and it continues to show up in the prophets. Israel's constantly being called back to the Sabbath. Well, what was it in practice for them? It was the time God set aside in a regular structure and order of things again, when they were to devote themselves away from their daily, duties of making a living and surviving, away from that to concentrating on God. And God as source, God as creator, and God as continual providential governor. That's what they were to see. That's why, to give an example, in the Exodus story, Israel's in the wilderness, the desert. They're not able to set up housekeeping and plant crops and stuff. They're on the move, and God provides for them the quail and the manna. And they're told specifically about the manna, this mysterious bread of heaven that will appear as a metaphor in the New Testament for Christ himself. But this bread of heaven, they're told on the 6th day, they're to pick up enough of this manna to last them on the next day, which is the Sabbath, the seventh day. God provides enough. Gather in enough. Normally it only lasts one day. The manna is a powerful, powerful story about what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. None of us think that way, do we? We have refrigerators and freezers, and we've advanced well beyond the need, to salt our pork and do all these things the ancients used to do. Or if we're going to have chicken for dinner, you go out in the yard and you kill one because they don't keep. You've got to kill them fresh, right? My father, when I was just a babe, and my father was practically a babe himself, his first job in Bakersfield, California, was delivering blocks of ice to homes and businesses. Any of you remember that? Some of you remember? Did any of you have an ice box? I kept calling refrigerators ice boxes until I was a teenager. And people started correcting me and said, they're not ice boxes, they're refrigerators. Because in the beginning, they were ice boxes with a compartment where you stuck this big block of ice to keep everything inside cold. My father's first job was delivering those blocks of ice. So we've gone beyond that, and now we take for granted. I've got a freezer with venison in it, and all these various things that, and we've got provision. As long as the power doesn't go out, we've got, freezer with stuff in it that we can pull out, and we all think that way now. But these people were taught to think in the wilderness, God's going to provide you only the food for that day. That's all. You can't store it. If you try to store the manna, it will spoil. You're dependent on God every day. That's the lesson they were supposed to get, and we're still supposed to get that lesson. Otherwise, why does Jesus say to pray, give us this day our daily bread? He wants us to get that lesson, that every day we're dependent on God for life and breath and everything else, for the stability of the natural order. In my astronomy work, I've discovered that we're surrounded by asteroids. There are thousands of them. We had a near miss recently. Did you know that? It didn't even make the evening news, to my knowledge, of a huge asteroid that came by the Earth. I forget how far away it was, but by astronomical standards, it was kind of a near miss. Some now think that that's what killed off the dinosaurs, is a huge asteroid impacting the Earth and covering the whole Earth with such a thick cloud of smoke and dust that it killed the plant life, which killed the dinosaurs. That's a theory. We don't know, but could be. There's increasing evidence that our own moon has been hit by several that might have hit us if they hadn't hit the moon. And on the story goes. How do we reckon with our survival? The Bible says you reckon with it by the fact that God in his providence has a plan and a purpose for earth and earth's people. It's moving toward that purpose. The end is in view. And that's why God has even yet preserved us. But the book of Revelation prophesies tremendous disasters that are yet to come. So we must always hearken back to that creation story. Psalm 33. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the water of the sea into jars and puts the deep into storehouses. In other words, even the great chaotic deep is just small stuff to God. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood forth. That's the biblical story of Genesis. I know I've summarized it in broad strokes. I don't feel like we have time to go into details, but anybody that wants more details, it's out there. I can provide you with places. The details about how we reason that Genesis 1 is primarily a story not about physical creation, but about the structuring and ordering of the creation, leaning in toward the Sabbath, which is the time when God and his image bearers meet, the time and place where God and his image bearers meet. And we're told in chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis that after Adam and Eve sinned, after they disobeyed God, it's God who's walking in the garden and he's looking for them. The whole implication is in the Holy of Holies that we call the Garden of Eden. It was the habit of God and his image bearers to meet and fellowship. But now they're hiding. And if there's anything about Genesis that carries forth into the 21st century, it's the recognition that human beings are still hiding from God. Still hiding. Still hiding. You can even hide from God in church. You can even hide from God when you sit down for a devotional time to read the Bible or a devotional book or a time of prayer. We can hide from God. We are masters at hiding from God in our inner being. You know you can't hide from God, but we will keep trying. I want to finish then with a jump to a gospel story, because the whole story in the middle is about restoring the image bearers back to what they were meant to be, right? That's what our purpose is, to be renewed and restored. If any man be in Christ, Paul will say, he or she is a new creation. That new creation is a restoration of the image. Well, remember the story in Mark 12 when some Jews, they're described in the text as Pharisees and Herodians, tried to trap Jesus. And so they asked him, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Well, again, it's hard for us to identify with this issue, but for the Jews of that time, who were occupied, to use the language we would use, occupied by Romans and Roman soldiers and encampments, it was a big controversy among Jews. God is our king, not Caesar. Why should we pay taxes? And they had a big controversy over this. So Jesus knew that they were trying to trap him. So he says to them, bring me a denarius, one of the Roman coins. They did. And Jesus said to them, whose icon is on this coin? Image. Icon is the Greek word for image. Whose image is on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus says, then render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but to God what belongs to God. Now, a thoughtful, biblically literate Jew would have immediately picked up the thinly veiled reference in that last part of the sentence to Genesis 1:27, where they would read in their Greek version of the creation story, man and woman were created in the icon of God. Render to God the icons that belong to God, his people.